right, shifting gears a little bit, talk about enforcement. I want to get a sense of your view of SEC enforcement when you came in, when you took office. Did you see things that you felt that you wanted to change?
Definitely. Well, for starters, I was what I would call a law and order Republican. I never had the slightest doubt or issue or reluctance to enforce the law. We're a society of laws. You have laws, people need to obey them. And so to me, enforcement is critical to the entire rest of the Commission working. And the interesting example is Great Britain, where they are spectacularly good at writing rules, but they don't enforce them. And the Securities and Investment Board in those days had 85 people writing rules and giving speeches about their rules, and they were all great, but they had no power to enforce their own rules. That had to go to the Serious Fraud Office, or somewhere in the British government there must be a minuscule fraud office.
So how are things working here in the U.S.?
And so the SEC's the thing globally that makes the SEC most unique, other than its resources, is the fact that it can enforce the law. And people can walk from the enforcement division down to the DC courts and seek an emergency injunction to freeze the assets of a Ponzi scheme, for example. And you don't have to write up a memo and send it over to the Justice Department, or in Japan they have to go to the Tokyo police. They're busy dealing with, if you ever saw the movie Kill Bill, the Japanese police have to deal with lots of serious problems like the New York PD. And if you said that the New York PD, like the Tokyo, is responsible for enforcing Rule 10b-5, they would laugh at you. And so enforcement doesn't happen. UK doesn't happen. But it does happen here. And I certainly came in believing that, you have laws, they need to be obeyed. And if the law is broken, there are avenues open to you to get the regulator or the Congress to change the law. But you can't take it into your own hands and just say, well, that law doesn't apply to me.
Right. You talk about Ponzi schemes, and that's an easy one. People might go to jail for that one. But when it came to instances of corporate malfeasance, there were things like settlements.
Yes. Well, the Commission had long had a practice of, like other prosecutors, of settling charges. And it promotes efficiency, it avoids the risk of loss at trial. There are lots of reasons why you can settle rather than litigate to the end. Now, if you're not careful as a manager, and the director of enforcement as the senior manager, and the chairman to whom the director reports, you have to be sure that settlement doesn't become a crutch, that we can file a suit, maybe it gets a lot of publicity, maybe the Commission talks about it, and then before you really have the nasty work of going to trial and proving it to a jury, you reach a settlement. And nobody admits or denies. And so there are good reasons for that in terms of efficiency of resources and otherwise. But you don't want that to be something that is used too often. And of course, the critical thing is, what are the terms of the settlement? And you don't ever want the staff being afraid to actually go to court and litigate. You want to have people, it was my view that you wanted people who were feisty and who loved a good trial. And you wanted the defense bar to understand the Commission is not reluctant to go to trial. Tom Newkirk was our head of the trial section in enforcement, was a terrific lawyer, and had some Ellen Cohn and some other terrific litigators working in the enforcement division, and I wanted to make sure that we gave them extra resources and lots of support, moral and otherwise, from the Commission to understand we want you to try cases. We understand that if you go to trial, sometimes you'll lose. We had an insider trading case out in Kansas one time, and it was something the commission thought was open and shut. And they had all kinds of evidence and went to trial in Kansas. The defense lawyer, the trial team was debriefing me later, and we got creamed. But the defense lawyer stood up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, do you see all those people over there at the prosecution table, the government? They're all from New York or Washington, D.C., and they want to put one of our local Kansas citizens in jail," kind of thing. Jury acquitted, and it didn't happen. It's a risk you take. You go to trial. So I wanted to make sure the trial people understood that it shouldn't be career-ending that you lost a trial. You don't need to worry about that. It should be career-ending if you're afraid to go to battle, because I can't afford to have a litigation team that is afraid to litigate or reluctant to litigate. So
did you...
There's a balancing there that you have to maintain. Great to have a settlement if you get a good settlement, and not so great if it's a lousy settlement.
Did you try to shift the balance a little bit, though, towards going to court?
Well, not so much going to court. Where I started was I tried to make clear to the staff that settlements that might have been acceptable in the past, don't even think about bringing them to me if it's a slap on the wrist. If the settlement doesn't have teeth, you shouldn't have brought the case. You shouldn't have spent the public's money to do the investigation, convince the commission that we should go to court and sue this person, if you then come back and say, and there have been too many examples of when I sat, or my clerks and I would sit and read the proposed settlement or read the order, and they say, well, we promise we'll never do this again, which was the ultimate formulation of injunctions. But sometimes then the defense bar had gotten very good of writing what it is you wouldn't do again. We will never again manipulate this stock in January of 1986, which means it's not an injunction against anything. And so I wanted to make sure that the commission staff, and I don't think that the enforcement staff was particularly reluctant, there's some reluctance, but there had been, over time, I thought, a complacency over the severity of penalties and what should be acceptable to warrant approval as a settlement. And I suppose the classic case where I made that point was the O'Hagan case, later went to the Supreme Court. We were sitting at but in the early stage when it first came to me, I was taken by surprise. We had calendared this review of a case brought against a lawyer, and the case was that this individual had embezzled out of client trust funds and used that to help finance a lifestyle that the staff chronicled involved very expensive houses in multiple locations, and this individual was particularly fond of high-performance cars. And the Washington Post had written about my Porsche that I drove to work every day, and I must confess I have always liked good cars, and he had very good taste, very expensive taste in cars, as they chronicled that. And so the staff, the allegations were that he had embezzled out of the client trust funds, and then when that was about to be discovered, he needed a source of funds to repay that stolen money. And so he was looking for somewhere else to steal more money to pay back the other stolen money. And he went to the law firm, roamed around on a Saturday, found papers on people's desks about a tender offer that was about to happen, went out and bought options and to profit from it, and we had him sort of dead to rights. Anyway, the staff lawyer, to my surprise, says, well, we have very good news. The defendant and counsel have agreed they want to settle. And they've agreed to return, to disgorge all the profits from the insider trading, all the improper gains, save only for a sufficient amount to fund his lifestyle, his ongoing living expenses. Maybe was the words that were used. And so the poor staff attorney says at the commission table, so we need guidance in negotiating a settlement of what lifestyle would be sufficient in the commission's view to allow him to use stolen money to fund. The staff person didn't say that, but that's what he was asking. How much stolen money? He agrees to give everything back, except he'll keep some of the stolen money to fund his lifestyle. What lifestyle does the commission think is appropriate? And without thinking, talking, anything, I just said, simple, naked, homeless, and without wheels. The lavish homes had to go, the garages full of beautiful Italian sports cars had to go. The naked part was, a pair of jeans would have been okay, but none of the wardrobes. And I found it, and it was something I hadn't planned, hadn't thought about, and that question had not been written down in the memo to the staff, from the staff to the commissioners before the meeting. So it just hit me unexpected as this, well, we're going to settle, and he's going to, and the staff was saying, we acknowledge he's going to use stolen money to live on. How much should we leave him with? And I thought that was a pretty stupid question. None is the right answer. You have stolen money, give it back, every penny. And so I made it a little more colorful, what lifestyle should we allow him to fund? Well, naked, homeless, and without wheels,
it was
i.e. nothing.
Colorful enough to stick. And I'd always wondered where the wheels came from, so now I know.
It was garages full of Ferraris. He had Ferraris, Lamborghinis, similar.
Another tool, the Penny Stock Reform Act came in around that time, very close to when you started, I believe. And
I think that had been passed under Chairman Reuter.
Okay.
Pretty sure. Penny stocks was a big focus for the Reuter Commission. Not so for the Breeden Commission. I thought, any time an investor is being defrauded, the commission should make it worth the commission's attention, whether it's trading in a high cap stock or whether it's trading in a penny stock. And we certainly, and I'm not 100% sure, maybe the penny stock reform bill maybe it passed after I became chairman, but certainly the heavy work was all done by Chairman Reuter and his staff, and they deserve all the credit. Dave made that a big focus. Again, as in situations I had, when you become chairman, you either have things that you're aware of when you come walking in the door, or that come to light as something's happening in the market, and then you see some area where the commission can do a better job. And so then you focus on it, and you make it a priority. And Dave made it a huge priority to deal with penny stocks, which had always been around, but there were bands of promoters who became more and more and more active. And I think the SEC's Denver regional office did a really good job, because there were a lot of mining stocks that were in the penny stock world. There were a lot of, I can remember dealing with a lot of reverse mergers of Israeli companies into U.S. shell companies, and then manipulations. And so it was an area of concern. But the intellectual work to develop the response and to apply it was really Dave Reuter's excellent work, and his staff, enforcement staff working with him. For me, it then became, well, all right, once the commission shines a spotlight, whether it's insider trading or penny stocks or market manipulation or some particular area, if you get, the crooks get out of hand and they're getting audacious, and all right, you need a bombing strike to come in and put things right. And but then you can't always bomb the same location, because then that leaves other areas unpoliced. And so Commission is always resource strapped, and that's probably appropriate. It forces us to prioritize and think about where our efforts are needed the most. And unlike the Fed, the SEC doesn't print money. We can't just ooze across the landscape of America. You have to justify what the Commission spends and use it efficiently. And so enforcement is very much part of that mix, and it's by its nature opportunistic. So if you have, I mean, I can remember driving to work one day, and I happened to have a testimony that day, and I think it was a budget hearing, but I happened to be going to appear on the Hill, and I'm driving to work. I didn't have a government car. I drove myself to work, and I'm listening on the radio, and they're describing that there are reports in the Journal of a possible run on the Treasury market, and a possible corner or attempt to corner of a part of the Treasury market. And there had been an auction in Treasury securities, and people think that the Treasury market cannot be manipulated. It's just too big. But sometimes people have to fulfill orders for a particular instrument. And you had things called off-the-run securities, and that became a little sub-market that for a period of time could be relevant. And if you could corner that little sub-market, then you could charge far above market levels, because somebody had to deliver a certain strip that they'd bought in auction. Anyway, I hear on the radio going to work that the Journal has run this story about the Treasury market possibly being signs of big manipulation. And I'm an hour away from walking into Congress and sitting down on television. So I remember the second the car pulled into the garage, get me McLucas, Bill, get down here. And I can't remember, I think Rick Ketchum had probably left by then. But anyway, it was to quickly learn whatever I could, because I knew I was going to get asked about it. And so that was something, and I get asked about it, and I said, well, we don't, we read the same story, Senator, and I don't know yet what I will know, and I'll keep you briefed and informed as we investigate what's going on, and if there's wrongdoing, we're certainly going to bring it to light and deal with it. Well, you can't imagine something that would be of more consequence to more Americans. I mean, almost everybody's mortgage was linked to the price of treasuries or credit cards or business loans. And so if somebody is manipulating up the price of treasuries by 50 basis points, then everybody in the country pays 50 basis points more on trillions of dollars of debt than they should based on a crime. So it certainly was something we thought was significant. But when putting together the agency's budget 9 months previously, I didn't know that was going to happen. We didn't plan for that. You just have troops that are available, and you have to reposition them sometimes and redirect and respond to what the market throws in your face. Some of it can be consciously planned, as they did with penny stocks, of saying, okay, we have this problem, and it's out of the Vancouver exchange, and we worked with the Canadians to try and get the Vancouver people to crank down on what they were allowing to happen. And then people taking securities traded in Vancouver and marketing them in Denver, and I had our Denver office working on it. Sometimes you see a problem and you plan it out. Other times, you have the Salomon Brothers bond trading scandal hits you in the face.
I was just going to ask you about that. Let's lay that out a little bit. It involved Fannie Mae, right?
Well, no. The Salomon Brothers scandal at its heart involved, Salomon at that time was the largest trading firm in U.S. government securities. And they were successful, they were powerful, and they didn't do equities. I mean, that was really the heart and soul of Salomon. They did commodities. They bought a firm called Fibro, and they had tried to expand, but Salomon was one of the biggest firms at the time, and it was very much concentrated in government securities. And Treasury decided at a point in time that they were getting nervous about the concentration that Salomon represented in the market. And Treasury has responsibilities for auctioning the public debt. The Fed actually conducts the auctions, but Treasury's Office of Public Debt has to fund the United States government. And so Treasury ends up putting out a rule that says you cannot purchase more than 35%. It was either 33 or I think it was 35% of any particular auction. And that would prevent any off-the-run issues from being cornered because you could never buy, whenever anything was being auctioned, one person couldn't buy more than 35%. And typically in Treasury auctions, they're oversubscribed. And they use a Dutch auction model, and so your orders get filled from lowest price to the government to highest price until they've sold everything they want to sell. And there's a risk that if the Treasury is selling 10 billion of two-year notes and you bid 2% and $20 billion worth of bids are put in at 2%, then all the bids at 2%, and if the auction reaches 2%, all the bids will be accepted, but prorated. So you had hoped to buy $2 billion in securities, and you end up getting $300 million because a lot of other people bid the same price. So the Treasury puts out a rule intending to make it hard to manipulate the Treasury market that says you can't buy more than 35%. Well, Salomon, the guy at Salomon running their trading desk was a guy named Moser, and his attitude was fine. We'll bid for 150%. We'll bid way more than 35% so that after we're prorated, we get our 35%. And he seemed to think that Salomon had a God-given right to get the maximum allocation. Treasury, in response, said, no, we can't have that. What we meant to say was you can't bid for more than 35%. Apparently, Moser was quite apoplectic about that and said, just watch me. And so Salomon didn't bid for more than 35%, but Moser would get other people to put bids in their names, but really for his account. And he would say, if you succeed in the auction, it doesn't matter what price you pay, don't worry, I'll take you out. You won't lose any money. And Salomon was the biggest firm in that area. So if you didn't cooperate with Salomon, you would see a lot less trading volume and, as a primary dealer. And so they had a lot of market power, and they were then violating Treasury's rule by stealth, by conspiracy, going to other firms and saying, this is really a bid for us, but put it in your name so that they won't catch us. And anyway, on one occasion, it came to light, and there was a big hue and cry, and Treasury was angry, and regulators, everyone looked, and there was a response by the firm of, okay, we're sorry, we won't let it happen again. But they let Moser stay on the desk. Same guy stays on the desk in charge of it. They don't put a lawyer or a compliance officer at his elbow to make sure, to listen to who he's calling and stop it. They just promised it wouldn't happen again, and the guy kept doing it. As far as he was concerned, it was an outrage and immoral for the Treasury to try and limit his ability to bid for these securities. This was an auction after all, how can you do this? And so he does it 35 more times. And at which point, it comes to light. And one lesson for fraudsters of any and all stripes is it eventually comes to light. And the government, and a lot of times people will say, where was the SEC? And the SEC generally doesn't do real-time enforcement. You can't be everywhere. So, it's after the fact, but you do respond.
So this is a case you wanted to respond?
So this one was very important because it goes to the whole integrity of the government bond market. And Congress had been involved. We had this attempted manipulation or argued, alleged attempted manipulation. And then we find Salomon is bidding for all these securities. And so it was really serious stuff. White hot news in the press, the Congress, everybody's focused on this. And I don't remember all the details, but one of the senior Salomon people, most senior corporate officers, was in my office and, in my opinion, lied to my face and unfortunately did the same thing at the Treasury and at the Fed. Secretary Breeden was deeply outraged and was determined that Salomon should be barred from any future Treasury auctions. Just kick him out. I was horrified at that because I thought Salomon would promptly collapse. And the suggestion we were going to do that caused then people stopped rolling over their repos with Salomon, and most securities firms are financed on a fairly narrow basis. And so Salomon had maybe 1,000 sources of liquidity, and they overnight start drying up because people say, whoa, they're reading, they might get kicked out. And then Jerry Corrigan at the New York Fed was a terrific, smart, capable person, and crossing Jerry was not a good idea. And so both the Treasury and the Fed felt they'd been lied to. I felt I had been lied to more by sins of omission than falsehoods, but nonetheless, if you have already discovered that one of your guys has violated the rules several dozen times, and you're looking eyeball to eyeball to a senior regulator, and you say everything is fine and you don't bother to mention it, in my book, that was a lie, and as with the Treasury and the Fed. So we had in a fairly short period of time, Salomon became a huge, huge risk of collapse. And we'd had Drexel Burnham and staved off disaster. We haven't really talked about Drexel Burnham, but it was really a pivotal situation of possible collapse of what was then one of the two largest securities firms. Right. And now here comes Salomon Brothers. And happily, Warren Buffett had bought about $750 million worth of Salomon preferred, which in 1990 was a lot more money than it seems like today. And we were able to call Warren and offer him the position of chairman of Salomon Brothers, which he accepted. And he was in my office the next morning, and he took out a piece of paper, pulled his pen out, wrote his home telephone number on it, and handed it to me, and he said, "There's my number, call it anytime, day or night." He said, "If anybody in Salomon hesitates for more than 30 seconds in giving your staff anything they want, you call that number, and they will be a former employee of Salomon. We will cooperate completely and totally. And, you know, the corporate community sometimes, I shouldn't say corporate community, the defense bar sometimes uses the phrase, well, we're going to cooperate, we promise to cooperate, and defendants promise to cooperate, and they seem to forget about that promise when they start the cooperation. Not Warren Buffett. He was, and I knew he would be exactly as he said, that he was, had no tolerance whatsoever for anybody breaking the law, wanted to clean Salomon up, did not see a reason for the thousands of employees there to lose their jobs, thought it was worth saving, obviously in his interest because of his investment, but I think much more broadly, fundamentally, didn't think that an entire firm should be wrecked because of bad judgment among the top officers. As it later turned out, and so he came in, he brought in a new CEO, and we were able to restructure Salomon and got stabilized, and we had to decide how much to fine them, and that was it's nowhere in the book. When the U.S. Code says for a violation you can be fined up to so much per day or so much for a violation, well, you're manipulating the Treasury market. It could be any number you want, and there's no guidance of, well, what number is enough to satisfy. If we find them something that was deemed in the public eye to be a slap on the wrist, then John Dingell and others would have been out there demanding that they be kicked out of as a primary dealer and other things. The firm would die. If we find them too much, the market might take that as a symbol that the U.S. government wanted them to die, and they might die. And so trying to find a middle ground of a penalty that seemed stiff enough to deter senior managers at other firms, should they contemplate systematic violation of the law. I ended up settling on a number, I think it was $240 million, which represented their last 2 quarters of profits, 100% of the last 2 quarters, 6 months worth of earnings, which I thought was enough to be noticed and painful, but shouldn't be fatal. And it worked. I mean, the company was later acquired, but Buffett did a wonderful job straightening it up, cleaning it up. His credibility was unmatched. So that part, the rescue part, worked very well. We then later, in our enforcement actions, had to deal with the senior officers, and the top 4 officers in the firm, the CEO, the president, the general counsel, and the vice chairman, all admitted that they knew what Moser was doing, but that when they talked to each other, they each thought the other was going to do something to control it and stop it. And so, you know, we had 4 people going like this. So we barred all 4 of them for life from the securities industry because we wanted, I think maybe one of them was for less than life, was for 10 years or something, but it was very stiff penalties. And he said, look, if you're all involved and you all admit you knew and somehow it didn't happen, we're not going to do nothing because we're not sure which of the 4 of you collectively were in charge, and you knew that there was serious wrongdoing going on. It was concealed from the government. You were putting at risk the entire financing system for the United States government. We're not going to tolerate that. And while we don't want all the employees to lose their jobs, and we don't want the company to go out of existence for the benefit of its investors and others, but we're not going to tolerate this. So it was a very stiff penalty. And along the lines, and talking in enforcement, I think throughout my tenure as chairman, I wanted to catch the crooks and beat them up. I mean, just as plain as that. And
were there any other landmark cases that you think sent a strong signal?
There were probably lots. I mean, we had the Mike Milken settlement early in my time. I didn't bring that case. I just had to settle it.
You had Charles Keating, too,
I can't remember that I had, maybe, but his main violations were over in the banking side of life.
The Salomon
There
thing.
were certainly a number, but the common theme that I tried to reintroduce into the culture of the agency was a little more of the, today you'd describe it Navy SEALs or Green Berets, or the enforcement division of the SEC is created and maintained at tremendous public expense, and it is not there to just do something that's going to become wallpaper on somebody's den or their bathroom, their injunctions. I mean, sanctions need to be meaningful and hurt. So I went to Congress to get legislation successfully to beef up tremendously the penalties that we could impose, because at that time we had disgorgement, but we couldn't find somebody. And I wanted the authority to have cease and desist orders. I wanted authority to impose fines, not tied to, disgorgement is calculated to, how much did the customer lose and you benefit? Well, in a case like the Salomon brothers, the world might lose trillions. You might arguably only benefit by millions. And I didn't want to be limited to millions. I wanted to be able to have the punishment fit the crime. So we needed authority to fine people. We needed cease and desist authority. I wanted the ability, which Congress gave us, though I don't think has been used enough, to bar officers and directors from serving as a public company. We had the ability to bar the managers at Salomon Brothers from the securities industry for life, but we couldn't bar a CEO or members of the board of a public company, Enron, who committed a massive fraud. And I thought the commission should have that authority. And in general, we went through and we gave the commission statutory authority to impose much tougher fines and sanctions.
Was this a major piece of legislation, or was it smaller riders on
No, it was a standalone bill. It's
Okay.
hanging on my wall, actually,
Do you
at
remember
home.
the name of it?
The Enforcement Remedies Act.
Okay. Great.
It has a fancier name than that, but I should add, not the real bill. The real bill is in the National Archives, but
Where it belongs.
But when the president signs them, that he signs multiple copies, and I have one with the pen that he signed. And actually, I have market reform, enforcement remedies, FIREA on the wall.
The Salomon Brothers case is that there was a joint study, TreasuryFed SEC, that got ginned up in '92. Do you remember that? And was that a result of what happened?
I can't remember the origins of the study, whether it came directly out of Salomon or not, or whether it just came out of time to oversee to update how government securities are regulated. And it's a shared responsibility between Treasury and the SEC, mostly, on oversight of people who were dealers in government bonds.
Okay.
And so we did a study, and I should say the staff did a study, did a terrific job. And I, kind of was involved in hearing of their progress as they went along, but it was mostly a staff study. One of the recommendations, though, that Treasury was in favor of, and that I strongly was in favor of, was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should have to, that the exemptions from SEC registration for securities of Fannie and Freddie should be repealed. And members of my staff will remember Frank Raines, who was then CEO of Fannie Mae, which was thought of itself as an independent country, I think, and was the owner of, by far, the most powerful lobbying team ever assembled on this planet. And Mr. Raines came in and to tell me how silly and stupid this was, and that we really should not seek to study. Having said these exemptions should be repealed, we were dutifully sending legislation to the Hill to accomplish that. And I remember Mr. Raines telling me that that wouldn't get to first base, and why do this, and what a waste of time and effort it was going to be, and we're going to beat your head in, kind of thing. And I said, well, you may, but we'll see who has the last laugh. This is something that needs to be done. I acknowledge you have far more lobbying ability than we do, and resources, and maybe we'll lose, but I owe the Congress our best judgment of what the right answer is. And they, not getting first base is, we didn't get out of the dugout before Fannie Mae had us hogtied and chopped into little pieces. So the legislation didn't go anywhere. And of course, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac later blew up in the 2008 era, and sad results. But we thought that, not that registration would have been a guarantee against it, but that it would have, we thought the exemption from registration created the implication that these were implicitly backed by the U.S. government. And I was working in the White House in 1982 when Penn Square Bank happened, and the first instance of too big to fail. And the controversies that had then swirled and have continued with us to this day of what happens when institutions that are too big to fail actually are going to fail, and how is it handled. And I don't think Penn Square Bank was an Oklahoma bank that was in turn financed by Continental Illinois, and it was Continental Illinois that the bank regulators thought was too big to fail. And so, Fannie and Freddie, and any time you get this implicit aura of protection, and then you have, and there are troubles, then you have an urge on the part of the Fed to, as the chief bailout architects, because I think Chrysler was the last time the U.S. Congress actually voted on a bailout. Right. Fed just goes off and does it. And they had done Nelson and Bunker Hunt. They went cornering the silver market in the early 80s, and they did long-term capital management. They've done many different interventions, including 2008. And Congress has responded to that, but we were dealing, or attempted to deal, with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae because we thought that those exemptions were not appropriate, that investors, they did involve risk, and investors should have that risk disclosed to them.
But GSEs like that aura of the government maybe being back there behind them.
Of course.
Another instance of you kind of taking on one of these very powerful adversaries that we have to touch on is your time talking to the CFTC and sort of having some jurisdictional type disputes. Set the stage on that one and how that played out.
Well, it's really a short story. I mean, the big fight had come under John Shad, and Phil Johnson John Shad was chairman of the SEC, and Johnson was at CFTC, and they had tussled over jurisdiction early right after the stock index futures were born. They ended up coming to something that was called the Shad-Johnson Accord, that was a peace treaty, a ceasefire agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it lasted for a number of years. And the Breeden Commission concluded in their review of 1987 that one of the contributing factors to the meltdown in '87 was problems in cross-margining between the cash market and the futures market. And that they were on one set of rules, the equities were on a different, they didn't connect, you had people doing program trading to exploit gaps, and the Breeden Commission recommended that stock index futures should be moved, regulation should be moved over to the SEC so that you had one set of rules, and particularly critically that you had margining rules that were not disconnects, that to maintain liquidity. So the Treasury, early on in my tenure, I think they had been working on it before I got there, had a bill to implement many of the Breeden Commission recommendations, including the stock index future. And I remember asking the Treasury guys when they said, we want you to support this, and it was presented to me as the President has decided this. Secretary has got this bill, the President has approved it, the Cabinet has approved it. One of the provisions calls for moving regulation from the CFTC to the SEC. You need to support that when asked. I said, okay, you know, this is the administration policy. And it was presented as administration policy. We understand you're an independent agency, but we expect support. So fine, I'm a team player, I'm happy to support, but I remember asking the gentleman I was talking to, it wasn't Secretary Breeden, what country is Chairman Graham going to be made an ambassador to? Because the wife of Senator Phil Graham was then chairman of the CFTC, and I was trying to put it in a light way to say, you know, come on, he's the ranking Republican on the Senate Banking Committee that has to approve this bill, and his wife is the sitting chairman of the CFTC, and you're stripping turf away from her and transferring it to the SEC? You can't be serious. And they said that, essentially, that's above your pay grade. The senator and secretary work together all the time, and I'm quite sure the secretary has figured that all out. I said, well, I sure hope he has, because otherwise, this would be the, you know, going over the top in World War I and into the face of all the machine guns, and hey, I don't have any shields here. And
it kind of looks like that's what happened.
That is exactly what happened, and it was silly from the beginning. Just a silly effort. I mean, it was an academician's concern about the untidiness of the system and gaps, and the better answer was, well, work together. Now, it would have been fine. People have long said, well, maybe the CFTC and the SEC, the entire agencies should be merged. That would make more sense. But even that, I don't see, you know, there's distrust, deep distrust between the Chicago markets and the New York markets, and so fine. What's the harm? As long as the functioning of the markets don't get disturbed. I mean, my chief of staff was an alumni of the CFTC. I knew that they had really good people, because she was a walking example of it. And so, you know, yes, I'll support it if, in theory, stock index futures should never have been moved over to the futures markets, and we shouldn't have the exclusivity clause of the Commodity Exchange Act and all these other things. But the Shad-Johnson Accord, in my feeling, was the better way to go, of work out, okay, we had 1987, here are the things that didn't work. Now how do we put a task force together between the two agencies and get it worked out? The Treasury's approach was, we need a steamroller that will forcibly transfer jurisdiction.
How much of your time did that soak up?
Every minute that I spent on it was wasted. So it was sad. I mean, you have only a certain amount of time, and sad to waste it on things that don't need to be. Now, as we mentioned earlier, I did think that changing the exclusivity clause of the Commodities Exchange Act was worth a fight, and that threatened the vitality of all the American markets, that as instruments were developed that contained elements of a cash market and elements of a futures market, were hybrid instruments. You didn't want to force all of them. The reality was, if they didn't think that the liquidity was good enough and they didn't want to trade them in Chicago, then they had to go to London or somewhere offshore. And I was a big believer my whole time in government that the American government doesn't work for our firms, but it is in our national interest to have our firms be economically successful, and the government should never do anything, in my opinion, that simply drives people offshore. If it's a legitimate activity, I wouldn't mind driving drug dealing offshore, so I did think the Commodity Exchange Act needed to be fixed, and we didn't do it legislatively, but we ended up fixing it through market creativity. But the rest of the stock index, which I think it involved 12 positions at the CFTC, as I recall. And I wasn't going to personally live or die over 12 positions. I mean, it just really became symbolic, and it became disproportionate to the actual stakes.
Let's talk about something that is really important to the actual stakes, which is your relationship with the staff. We've gone through the history and some of the things that happened, but we haven't really talked about what you did or how you changed the culture in the SEC in the time you were there, as it relates to the staff in particular.
Well, thank you for asking about that. To this day, it remains one of the great joys of my life, the privilege I had of leading the men and women of the SEC. And on countless, I could sit here and name person after person in the General Counsel's office. We haven't talked about the General Counsel's office, Chief Economist's office, and the Chief Accountant's office, and every corner of the Commission, but talented, talented people. Not every last one of them. The SEC does have duds, along with every other organization, but not many, not many. And I thought the leadership was outstanding, and it was just a great privilege to lead that team. And I felt that my senior staff could have led any agency in government. They were such talented people, and talked about them, but Marianne Smythe and Bill McLucas, who I appointed as enforcement director, he was only my second appointment after Michael Mann, but he still was a good appointment. Rick Ketchum, Linda Quinn, and we went to Argentina, we went to China, we went all over the world helping countries establish markets and make markets work better. And they just were a group of people with, and this is the most senior staff, who I worked with every day. And those people were had awesome talents and were tremendous.
What do you do to bring out those talents?
Well,
let those talents work?
And not just at that level, but then you have a much broader body of employees. We had about 3,800 employees maybe at that time. And so as chairman, you want to try and reach and connect. I mean, it's difficult to work with every single, if you have 4,000 people, to work with each of them personally. But over the course of my 4 years, I certainly came in contact with huge numbers of them, and on different projects. So I wanted to energize the commission when I got there. I thought that the commission I'd seen from the White House, Treasury in the room, the Fed in the room, I'd seen where the decisions were made about the United States and its role in the world and what we wanted Japan to do or what we wanted to that. I'd watched the President of the United States make policy. And the SEC didn't come up very often in those discussions. And it was doing a great job worrying about penny stock fraud in the Vancouver Stock Exchange, but it wasn't necessarily at the table in the discussions of what was going to replace Glass-Steagall and other big-ticket items that I thought the SEC needed to be in the heart of the discussions because they were the great issues of the future of the capital markets. And I acknowledge the importance of the Fed and its importance of its role, but in my view, the SEC and the Fed are the two most significant agencies. Not to criticize or disrespect any other agency. They all have talented people and important missions. But the Fed in banking and the SEC in securities have a critical role. But it wasn't playing that. And I don't know all the reasons. I just knew from my ability to watch that it didn't seem to be. And it had a somewhat inward focus. And this is a vulnerability in any agency, but certainly true of the SEC, along with others. Sometimes you can, every year you can revise and revisit your latest interpretations of some microscopic issue. Market reg had this problem big time, and that's why I put my little rule in, which I tried to say jokingly, but I was very serious, that don't dare send me another thing with more than 75 footnotes, because that's the illusion of precision. And you're down so far in the weeds, but you're not conveying. And if the chairman's going to sign the letter, the chairman is not sending out a letter with 140 footnotes. He's going to talk about the big thing. You can send that out, but if you want me to sign it, it needs to be more appropriately focused on the major issues of the day, whether it's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or whether it's the integrity of the Treasury market, or whether it's Glass-Steagall, or whether it's why aren't foreign firms using the American capital markets, and are we losing ground to London or Frankfurt. These are the things the SEC should be worried about. These are not things that are beneath their worry while they're reinterpreting Rule 10b-7-16 cap A little 3 I's. So I wanted to, I thought there were a number of things that needed to be done. One of the measures, one of the really flashing red light warning systems, I think we had 12 or 13% attrition per year when I walked in the door, and it was under 3% when I left. So I'm very, very proud of that. But it was agencies, if they've gotten kind of put out to pasture or off on a sideline, that people know it, they can feel it, and then it's hard to give the same effort. And if you're just replowing the same field, eventually that can get a little dull. And so
it sounds like there's sort of a focus on mission rather than on the routine or something.
Well, I wanted to be sure that, and from the first meeting I had when I was being briefed for confirmation through to the last day I was there at the commission, I always kept trying to, if I saw a big issue or thought there was a big issue in the world, I thought this team of people had the skills better than almost any agency in government to develop solutions. And so you needed to challenge them with that. And one avenue for it was our congressional testimony, and I testified 55 times before Congress during my tenure. And it was always painful. It was like having your wisdom teeth extracted, because I thought congressional testimony was really important. I'd worked a lot with Congress. I knew the members I was going to be testifying in front. I cared about whether we sounded like a bunch of bureaucratic gobbledygook or whether we could lay out a persuasive articulation of what we thought was good public policy. But as a result, I would edit these testimonies personally after the staff gave theirs, and my editing is often slow. And anyway, I could always find a way to improve it, and we had a couple of times when we were still working on the testimony the morning we were going to give the testimony, which was horrifying to Marianne Smythe and Bill McLucas or Linda Quinn or whoever was the relevant agency. But we ended up with great product, and we articulated, I think, our public policy views, the importance of functional regulation, that banks were going to get into the securities market. They shouldn't do it with historic cost accounting, and they shouldn't do it with secrecy, and they shouldn't be able to hide their losses. It should be done the same way that a securities firm has to do it. And similarly, if a securities firm was going to go into banking, fine, that needed to be under the banking world's rules, not ours. And so there were a lot of public policy issues, how you handle mutual funds, how you just, in those 55 times, some of them were budget appearances that were, I would call, relatively routine, and some of them were pretty dramatic, of things like the government bonds scandals or others. So, but it was important to me to help. I thought getting the commission back at the table of public policy in Washington and reminding the House and the Senate and all the other agencies what a tremendous contribution the SEC had to make, the tremendous intellectual power that was under that roof every day, and getting them engaged. And that, I think, helped really energize people. Similarly, our international efforts, people saw we were reshaping the world. I mean, the Berlin Wall had just come down. Things that people had left, the Cold War is ending. Things that people at the SEC had lived with. When I was in the 3rd grade, I had to hide under the desk. We did air raid drills, getting under the desk in California, and for the risk of nuclear war. All that suddenly changed. The world was different. Well, what's the new world going to look like? Well, my view was that the SEC senior staff were people who, at least in our corner of the world, the financial markets, should be the ones on the front lines helping develop that. And we did. So whether it was the international effort, whether it was revitalizing the CorpFin rules and proxy standards, whether it was coming up with the rules of the game for the next 50 years of the Investment Company Act, I actually commissioned a similar study in Market Reg, which was not nearly as successful, I think.
That's Market 2000?
The Market 2000, but only because it's a much more complicated, it took a lot more time to work its way through, but at least I got the effort started. But I thought energizing the senior people and then all the way down the line in intellectual challenges that so-so wasn't good enough, if we were given testimony that it needed to be the very best testimony we could give. If we were filing a brief in court, I think SEC had always had Jake Stillman and others, and Paul Gonson had always tried to write the very best brief that could be written. But that across the board in the commission, the sine qua non needed to be excellence. And we can't stand around, I used to say to people and believe that you can't stand around congratulating yourself that you have the best staff in government and then do a mediocre job on anything. The country deserves your best, and let's give it to them. And I did try to get the computers and get decent office space. I was successful in slipping a rider into an appropriation bill that took the SEC out from under the GSA so we could lease our own buildings, put people in good offices instead of the GSA seems to specialize in renting buildings that no one else in the world wants to occupy. And how can you expect to hold on? I mean, your enemy is people in the outside market that know how good the SEC staff is and want to pirate them. So if you have somebody, whether it's a Linda Quinn or any of the stars, and I don't mean just division directors, right down through the ranks, we were losing 12, 13% a year. That meant we were turning over the entire commission in 6 years. Well, some of our cases last 6 years. We had litigation teams, some big cases would go through 2 or 3 groups of people. This is a problem in the Justice Department and U.S. attorneys' offices, too. So I wanted to get them pay increases. It was a shock to me how badly paid the SEC staff, senior staff were. And people accepted that the Fed, the FDIC, and the Comptroller of the Currency and the credit unions could pay anything they wanted. They were financed by fees, let them pay whatever they want. Well, we competed with them for talent, as well as with the private sector. And we made a profit every year. Why couldn't I match their salaries? And that was a big fight. I got it through the Senate. I got 1 vote shy of getting it through the House to get out from under GS pay standards. Lost it, but hopefully we won the war, even though we lost the battle. I got the Office of Personnel Management to give us dozens and dozens of new senior executive staff provisions. We got new bonus pools. We got things that I was then able to help, at least, and to make this incredibly important national asset. These people recognize that, well, we're not just saying you're important, but then we want to treat you in a shabby way. Let's give you a good office and a great beeper and a bonus at the end of the year, and and a lot of energy, and of course the main thing that will hold good people is the work they do and feeling that it's important. But it's a circle of either self-reinforcing or self-destructive things that you have to try and put together to slow the attrition, get the pride back, get the hustle back in the step, and make sure that people knew, okay, we're not just going through the motions here, we're not just papering the walls, we're doing stuff that really counts. And I think we accomplished that.
How about the commission itself? The commissioners. You mentioned yesterday how, it was pretty clear that you were going to get commissioners that could work with you. How did you work with them? How did you run your meetings? What were the ins and outs of that?
Well, that's a subject as old as the commission itself, and it's hard when you have a choice. The Office of Thrift Supervision or the Comptroller of the Currency or bureaus within the Treasury, they have one person. And so if they're going to impose a sanction or if they're going to change the rules, it's just one person's judgment. With the Fed and the SEC and the CFTC, Congress made a judgment that the issues are big enough to merit a collective judgment and a bipartisanship. So no more than 3 commissioners from any one political party, though that has certainly not prevented the growth of partisanship. The horrible partisanship we now have in every aspect of our national life, from intruding into the commission, but it wasn't there when I was privileged to serve, and I did my best to try and make sure it didn't appear. But so working with the commissioners, so you have a judgment that, all right, you'll have a board of 5. Well, one of those is a full-time job, the chairman. And under Harry Truman's reorganization order in 1950, the SEC chairman is this true CEO. I mean, the staff all reports to the chairman. And then each commissioner has staff, and they have an equal vote on regulations and on enforcement decisions, and they have a tremendous contribution they can make intellectually, and do make regularly. And there have been some terrific commissioners who never became chairman, but who have contributed mightily over the years to the commission. But you can also have people who are frustrated if they see all the errors and mistakes they think a chairman is making, and that little voice in the back of their head that I would look good sitting behind that chair with the seal that says chairman, and I could do this better. And so, I'm not talking about just the commissioners in my time. I'm talking about since 1934. So right. You have times when people get along pretty well personally, good chemistry, and you have times when they don't. The Reuter Commission, I think, was a time of tremendous dysfunction. I was fortunate for the most part. Our commissioners liked one another and were able to get along personally.
What about philosophically? Did you have serious divisions in their outlook on regulation?
I think we had one commissioner who had a different view of life and the role of the commission, and the rest of us, I think, the other 4, although the 4 changed over the years, I mean, as people came in and went out, generally pretty philosophically consistent. And we had some great contributions. I mean, Phil Lochner was somebody I had practiced law with in New York and had gone on to be corporate secretary at Time Warner and a significant player in the corporate world. And I wanted somebody who came from an issuer and brought the issuer's perspective to the commission table. And we had Carter Beese, who was, again, somebody I knew and had identified as a tremendous individual with a very broad network in Wall Street, had been at Alex Brown, So he was not a New York Wall Street guy, but he had a very great feel for the trading markets, and in a way that could balance out in some divisions. I mean, market reg, there wasn't anybody who had been in private life in the senior level for at least 10 and maybe 20 years. Well, a lot of things changed. So Carter could bring a perspective on, okay, what's an academic worry but not a real big deal, and what's a real big deal in case you didn't notice it, kind of thing. And so he was a terrific commissioner from the market reg knowledge. More broadly than that, I didn't expect people to be just pigeonholed, but wanted, any good board has people with different backgrounds. Rick Roberts was terrific. He had a tremendous knowledge and lively interest in municipal securities and the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. And I must confess, that was well outside my wheelhouse of expertise. And I wanted to keep it that way. Just, no one person has time to deal with everything. And so it was terrific to be able to, with Phil, with Carter, with Rick, to say, all right, can you lead our efforts whenever there is a meeting going on with municipal securities rulemaking, the commission needs to be represented? I'm not going. You're going to go as my representative. Please brief me so I can make sure the staff is, connected to you and supports you and everything, but you take the lead on that. And we did that as often as possible. So I thought it was generally, there are times where you think somebody's leaking something or talking out of school, or the inevitable
It's going to happen.
friction happens. But on the most part, I thought it was terrific. And I think each of them shared with me, with possibly one exception, I think each of them shared with me the joy of walking into the building every day and knowing the people you're going to work with and the fascinating issues you're going to confront. I mean, every single day, we're sitting there at the intersection of markets, technology, and communications, data processing, and the intersection, and people figuring out how to finance the planet Earth. And we just added 50% to the population of people using market economies, or doubled it. And so it was an exciting time. The international thing, I keep going back to it, but this was something Mary Shapiro was very interested in. The international effort and the international bodies, but we worked hard to get foreign companies to realize that coming to the U.S. market was something that made a great deal of sense for them. The Mexican government was going through a modernizing, embracing private sector markets and so on, and they wanted to privatize the telephone company, Telmex. And I went down with a whole team of people, including Mary, but Linda Quinn and Michael and Marianne Smythe and Barbara Green, who replaced when I lost Barbara. When I lost Marianne to investment management, Barbara Green came in and took over as chief of staff and did a wonderful job. Paul Atkins, who later became a commissioner, was one of my law clerks. I recruited him from Washington. Dick Walker, I recruited in from Cadwalader, I think was his firm, to run the New York office, who later became general counsel and enforcement director. So we had all these people with great talent, and we were trying to say to the world, come here. We can't finance every project, and you're free to use your local banks. But for major companies with huge capital needs, that here's the most liquid market in the world, the most efficient market in the world, and we're open to everyone. And that was I mentioned the 144A was one of the ways I used to say to people, try it, you might like it. You've heard all these horrible stories about being afraid of the SEC, It's interesting, I got to tell this one quick story. I was at Davos, World Economic Forum one time, walking down the hall, and this gentleman stops me, and he says, Chairman Breeden. I'd never seen him before in my life, and he comes over and said, nice to meet you. He said, told me his name, and he was CEO of, I think, the Caracas Power and Light. This is well before the current problems in Venezuela, I might add. And he said, well, I just wanted to thank you. I said, for what? What did I do? You're welcome. What did I do? And he said, well, we recently did a big financing in the U.S., and I thought he was about to thank me for the capital they raised. And he said, but you really helped me clean up my company. And I said, yeah. He said, when we got ready to do our listing in New York, I got all my senior managers together, and we closed the door and said, we have some corporate governance practices that have grown up historically that none of us are proud of. And he was talking about bribery and other things, and he says, none of us are proud of, and that's not the way we should run this company. So now we're going to do a listing in New York, and Chairman Breeden and the SEC will come get you if this stuff doesn't stop. And he said, I told them all, this was, he said, you were my bogeyman, but, you were going to put everybody in jail in New York if you didn't clean up the company. And he said it worked beautifully. He says our company today has gotten out of some very, very bad habits and is running better. And that, that happened over and over again when we did probably the crowning, the achievement was getting Daimler-Benz of Germany, the first German listing, and getting them to come here. And after years throughout my chairmanship of having the German ambassador, the German finance minister, the German chancellor talk to the president of the United States all about German companies arguing that they should be able to raise primary capital, sell securities to retired school teachers in Peoria, Illinois, or Joplin, Missouri, using German accounting rules, which were the worst in the world, least transparent. And I kept saying to all of them, no, our markets are open to you. We'd love to have you come raise capital here. And Toyota's here, and Volvo's here, and Ford's here, and GM is here, and we'd love to have Volkswagen or Mercedes, but you have to do it on the same rules everyone else does, which is you can use your local accounting, but you have to give a bridge, the Rosetta Stone. You have to give reconciliation to U.S. GAAP. And the Germans, for domestic reasons, were adamant that they would not do that. And Germany had at that time, I think, a very high 50 or 60% corporate tax rate. And so the German accounting, which was not transparent at all, allowed them to manage earnings and accumulate hidden reserves and declare relatively low profits on which they would pay a very, very high tax. And they wanted to keep doing that. And they were, I think, embarrassed that if they published a prospectus in the U.S. saying that they earned $10 billion, but they filed a tax return in Germany that said they earned $500 million, that there could be some consequences, and that the tax authorities would be smart enough to go read their filings. And I said, look, I can't solve that problem for you by letting you hide what you're making. Everybody, doesn't matter what country you're from, what business you're in, you have to comply with the disclosure rules. We're a transparent market. And they fought, and we argued and argued and argued, and finally, after George Bush was defeated, in Davos, a senior partner of Goldman Sachs came up to me and said that the CFO of Daimler-Benz would like to have breakfast with me or dinner and talk about listing, that they want to come and do the U.S. listing there. They've committed to it. And I said to him, Eric, we just had election. My guy lost. I mean, I'm leaving. Maybe the next chairman will give in. And he said, no. He said, they want to do it under you. He said, they want the gold standard, the good housekeeping seal, and they want to do it the right way, even if later on somebody lets people do it the bad way.
You just walked up to the topic I wanted to hit, is the decision to leave.
And, well, hang on, let me just briefly finish the Daimler-Benz. So we had one meeting scheduled, which turned out to be the day that a bomb went off in the World Trade Center where our offices were, and so that meeting got postponed, and then we did another one, and in the end, after all the years of arguing and fighting, we sat down, and it was the Daimler CFO, the head of the outside accounting firm, and the inside accountants, and myself, and Linda Quinn, and I think Jim Doty, Michael Mann, but a fairly small team. We met them in New York, and I said, okay, within the realm of you've got to reconcile to U.S. GAAP, but what can we do? What are your problems? They had spent a year studying what the problems were in listing. And the first issue they had was how they would account for warranties on their cars. And German accounting had a certain way they accounted for warranties, and the U.S. rule was different, and there was some reason why accommodating them. They could do it over a long period of time, but doing it with historic data that they hadn't kept, they couldn't do. I said, no problem. We can solve that with a footnote. I mean, and a go forward. And then there was something on German Social Security, their retirement obligations. But in the course of 3 or 4 hours, we were done. And Daimler came, and then the rest of German industry followed. But over and over and over again, it was a case of trying to show people that the SEC was not at all closed-minded. We were not against foreign finance. We would, in fact, welcomed it and supported it. But recognizing that different countries have different retirement systems and other facilities that you have to make accommodations to, and without sacrificing your principles of full disclosure. And I think when we ended up doing it, it was kind of shocking. The Daimler, these are not the exact numbers, but they reported a loss of 100 million euros in Germany and a $2.5 billion profit under U.S. GAAP. But it was, it was a material difference, and fine. Investors got both, and you could believe the German accounting. But the German accounting, 40% of their balance sheet and or income statement was in one line item, provisions, with no further discussion. So, we helped shine the light of transparency there, and as I hope the SEC will always do.
So was it just a matter that George Bush had been defeated, and you did that? Is that when you made the decision to step down?
Sure.
Okay.
Presidential, you don't overlook presidential elections, so obviously,
it's a big thing.
Obviously President Clinton would want his own person. And I'd been there for 4 years. I mean, I was the 4th youngest chairman in the history of the agency. So I became chairman at the age of 39. By that point, I was the 6th longest serving chairman. We'd done 1,208 enforcement actions. That's a lot of memos to read, a lot of thinking and working. I had gone all over the world. I had worked 7 days a week, 16 hours a day for 4 years, and I was tired. Invigorated, but nonetheless tired. So even had Bush been reelected, I probably would have decided that 4 years, somewhere in the, maybe I would have stayed another year, but I mean, it was getting time to, and I think it's good for the commission to, each chairman comes in with their interests and their passions, but also their blinders. And I think 4 years is, there's a reason we have a presidential election every 4 years. It's a good time to reassess. It's long enough to get things done, but hopefully short enough to prevent you from being stale and having the commission get overly focused on your priorities, but maybe somebody else would come in with a different agenda. So, that was it didn't change much for me because I would have gone back to private life. I think it's different if there are lots of people who have become chairman in their mid or late 60s, and where you're ready to retire. I mean, your business career is done, and now you're going to do public service, and maybe then you would stay. There have been both John Shad and Arthur Levitt stayed 7 years, and I can't imagine that. I mean, that would have, God bless both of them, but it was, so the election really didn't change it might have by a few months changed my timing. And as it was, the incoming counsel of the president for President Clinton was a former partner at the law firm I'd worked at, and I knew well, and he called me up, and I don't know, a couple months into things, and said, Richard, everybody's comfortable with you. John Dingell says you're great. Chris Dodd says you're great. We haven't picked anyone yet. Please don't go. We don't want an empty chair. We're all comfortable with you. Please. And this was after we bounced one of their potential cabinet nominees because of some securities trading issues he had. And so they were couldn't have been nicer, and I was perfectly happy being Bill Clinton's chairman. I mean, from the standpoint of an independent agency, it's not a big change because you're not going to meetings over in the White House. So it worked out very well, and so I agreed to stay a little longer, but I said, look, and I had young kids, so for me, I needed to, my window was between end of May and September, that I had to have the kids be in school, and I was not planning to stay in Washington. I wanted to go back to New York, and so, I ended up leaving in, I think, early June and getting my kids back to be ready to enroll in school in September. But it was the Clinton people, the Clinton White House were very nice. They were very classy to deal with.
Anything else we should talk about that we've missed?
Oh, we've hardly scratched the surface.
But, something about those 4s. 4 years, we've talked for 4 hours. And I think we've done a great job. I really appreciate you taking this time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I will, I only wrap up emphasizing what a national treasure I think the SEC has always been, how much it means to people who don't know anything about it. I mean, the average guy with a 401k, the average guy or gal with 401ks trying to figure out how to finance their kids' college education without drowning in debt, the people trying to move from one generation to the next and accumulate wealth. And there are people in this country who think accumulating wealth is a bad thing and deserves a dirty name, and shame on them as far as I'm concerned. I never found it philosophically challenging to rejoice in the economic success of every American. And the markets are a place for democratizing our economy, in my view, of letting the ordinary person participate in owning even the biggest companies. And that was not reserved and monopolized for one class of people. It was open to anyone. A New York City cab driver could invest in stocks, and that sets America apart. And the SEC has helped keep it an open market and a fair market. Fairness is a tough thing because you have a securities trade, somebody profits, somebody else doesn't profit. So is that fair? Well, yes, it's fair if everybody had an equal access to information, and if markets weren't driven by manipulation, they run on supply and demand. So the SEC, in ways that the general public doesn't see very often, might see a famous case of insider trading or something, but the real importance of the commission to the country and to the world is as the leading exponent of open markets and competitive markets and markets that operate not on manipulation, not with people somewhere rigging the outcome, but on forces where everybody is free to build their companies and compensate their employees and have the public participate. And a huge amount at stake. I was honored that President Bush gave me the chance to lead the agency. He was the greatest man I ever had the privilege of knowing and working with, as not to the exclusion of my father and many other people who have been important in my life, but George Bush was an inspiration to me every day that I was there and in the 30 years since then. But he gave me a privilege that was tremendous. I tried every day to justify his confidence in me and to justify the efforts of every man and woman at the Commission. And I hope that everyone who fills that job from now through eternity has the same attitude and does their best. I mean, we're all human and we're all fallible. We can make mistakes of every kind and shape, but hopefully the common denominator, you have a superb staff. I always hope that the staff doesn't bog down in self-congratulation, that the staff, and I think that is a risk to the SEC, that maintaining excellence really means maintaining vigilance against the easy answers and the routine, and we've always done it this way. And excellence, true excellence, demands staying up to date. But at the same time, when you have a principle like our capital rules, we didn't talk about Mike McElroy, and maybe I'll do another session sometime, but we had a long fight over reconciling U.S. to U.S. GAAP for foreign companies. We had a long fight over an attempt to impose bank capital standards on the U.S. market. We've had disagreements over whether the Fed should bail out Drexel Burnham, where we eventually prevailed and prevented them from bailing them out, which they wanted to do, and which would have been catastrophic for market disciplines. But in area after area, when you boil down what the SEC does, there are underlying principles. And the staff and the commissioners and the chairman all have to understand those principles and re-examine them always, but try and apply them to what the world throws at you. And I know it's been a source of great joy for me over the intervening decades of working with seeing whenever we get together, my colleagues who were on that journey with me in those years. And we know we changed the world for the better. And, we don't always, not all of us get a chance to, you talk about giving back, and, well, we all had a chance to give back, and we're successful, I think, in, not that we were perfect, and not that every decision we made was the right one, but we did leave the world a better place than it was, and we left the Commission a better place, and hopefully, if each generation has that attitude and that determination, then the agency will continue to deserve that reputation for excellence that it's always enjoyed.
Terrific place to stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken.